By the time my daughter arrived home that evening, all she found was a manila envelope taped to the front door and two police officers waiting on the porch. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really began, to a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of morning where the light comes in low and golden through the kitchen window, and everything feels peaceful, right up until the moment it isn't. I was 71 years old, retired, a former senior accountant who had spent 34 years tracking every dollar that moved through a regional logistics firm in Columbus, Ohio. I knew numbers the way some men know scripture by heart, by instinct, by the quiet authority of someone who has never once been fooled by a figure that didn't add up. My name is Robert, and I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. I am not a man who raises his voice. I never have been. My late wife, Margaret, used to say that the most dangerous thing about me was how calm I stayed when things went wrong. She meant it as a compliment. I chose to take it that way. My daughter, my only child, is named Claire. She is 43 years old. She has her mother's eyes and, as it turned out, very little else of her mother's character. Her husband, my son-in-law, goes by the name Derek. Derek sold insurance. He was the kind of man who always seemed to be performing friendliness rather than feeling it, a firm handshake that lasted half a second too long, a smile that arrived slightly before the joke did. After Margaret passed, 3 years ago this past spring, Claire suggested that she and Derek move into my house on Birchwood Lane. It was a 4-bedroom colonial that Margaret and I had owned outright for 11 years. No mortgage, no liens, valued at the time at roughly $420,000. Claire's reasoning was presented as generosity. She said she was worried about me being alone. She said the house was too big for one person. She said it would be good for all of us, that I could help with their finances while they recovered from what she described, vaguely, as a difficult couple of years. I agreed, because she was my daughter, because the house felt too quiet without Margaret, because I believed, in the way that fathers sometimes foolishly believe, that blood means something permanent. For a while it was fine. Not warm exactly, but functional. I cooked most evenings. I kept the yard. I paid the property taxes, the utilities, the homeowner's insurance, all of it, because the house was mine and I had always paid my own way. Derek contributed a modest amount each month toward groceries, which he mentioned often enough that I began to find it difficult to eat breakfast without feeling indebted. Then, 8 months ago, things shifted. It was subtle at first, the kind of shift you feel before you can name it. Derek started making comments at dinner, casual, almost offhand, about how big the house was, how it must be hard for me to manage the stairs, how a lot of men my age were finding that smaller places were actually more comfortable, more manageable. He said the word manageable the way people say it when they mean something else entirely. Claire started joining these conversations. She would talk about assisted living facilities in a tone of studied neutrality, the way a real estate agent describes a house with foundation problems, emphasizing the light, the community, the amenities, carefully not mentioning what was wrong underneath. I listened. I said very little. I have always found that listening is an underrated skill. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was a Thursday, early November. I had come downstairs before 6, which was my habit. I have never been able to sleep past dawn, not since my 30s. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with a crossword puzzle I had no intention of finishing, and through the wall that separated the kitchen from the small sitting room where Claire sometimes took her morning calls, I heard my daughter's voice. She was on the phone. I was not trying to listen. I want to be clear about that. I simply sat very still, the way you do when you realize that moving will make a sound, and the sound will change what is being said. Derek thinks we should do it after the holidays, she said. It's less complicated that way. Better optics. Pause. No, he won't fight it. You know how he is. He'll be upset, but he won't. He's not that kind of person. He never pushes back. Another pause. The plan is to get him to sign the financial power of attorney before January. Derek's cousin knows someone at an estate law firm. Once we have that, the house sale is straightforward. We list in February. When the market picks up, his pension and savings go into the joint account we set up. And then, she lowered her voice then, just slightly. And then we help him find somewhere appropriate. There's a place in Westerville. It's not bad. He'll adjust. I sat with my coffee going cold in front of me. I did not feel rage, exactly. What I felt was something colder and more clarifying than rage. It was the feeling I used to get in the middle of an audit when a number finally revealed what it had been hiding all along. Not surprise. Recognition. I set down my mug. I picked up my crossword. I wrote in 2 answers I had already known and pretended to consider a third. And I began to think. The first thing I did that same morning, before Claire came into the kitchen for her own coffee, was go upstairs to the small office I had maintained in the back bedroom. I kept my files there, 30 years of financial records, property documents, tax returns, the deed to the house, Margaret's estate paperwork, everything organized, labeled, cross-referenced. The habit of a man who had spent his career making sure that nothing important could be disputed. I pulled the deed. My name, Margaret's name, transferred fully to mine upon her passing, probated cleanly with no complications. Then I called my attorney. His name is Gerald Whitmore. He has been my attorney for 22 years. He is not a flashy man. He favors beige cardigans and speaks in the measured cadences of someone who chooses each word the way a surgeon chooses an instrument. I told him what I had heard. I told him what I suspected. I told him I wanted to understand exactly what my options were and exactly what protections existed. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always valued about Gerald. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Robert, the power of attorney is the key. If you never sign it, they have no legal mechanism to access your accounts or compel a property transfer. Your assets are entirely yours." "I know that," I said, "but I want to make sure they can't manufacture consent. I've heard of cases." "Then we document everything," he said. "We begin today." Over the following weeks, Gerald helped me put several things in place. We established a clear, witnessed, and notarized statement of my full mental competency, signed by Gerald, by my physician of 16 years, and by 2 neighbors who had known me for over a decade. We moved the bulk of my liquid savings, approximately $280,000, into an account at a different bank, one that Claire had no knowledge of and no access to. The account required 2-factor authentication on a phone number registered only to me. We filed a formal record of the property deed with a title protection flag, meaning any attempt to transfer or encumber the property would trigger an automatic notification to Gerald's office and require my verified in-person authorization. And I purchased, from an electronics store on the other side of Columbus, a small digital voice recorder, the kind that fits in a shirt pocket and records continuously for 14 hours on a single charge. I am telling you this not to make myself sound clever. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that what I did was not impulsive. It was not emotional. It was methodical. Because I had spent my entire career being methodical, and I saw no reason to stop, simply because the stakes had become personal. I continued living in the house on Birchwood Lane as though nothing had changed. I cooked dinner. I maintained the yard. I watched the evening news and did my crosswords. I asked Derek how work was going, and I listened to his answers with the same polite attention I had always given them. But now I was also listening to everything else. In December, Derek invited his cousin Marcus to dinner. I had met Marcus twice before, a thin, careful man who sold things for a living and had the practiced ease of someone who spent a lot of time asking people to agree to things. At dinner, the conversation eventually turned, as I had expected it would, to the topic of estate planning. Marcus mentioned, apparently in passing, that a lot of people my age were finding it useful to have a trusted family member hold financial power of attorney. Just for convenience, he said. Just in case. Nothing dramatic. He had a form, actually, if I was ever interested. Just something to look over, no pressure. I said I would think about it. I said it with the mild, slightly vague expression that I had cultivated over the past 2 months. The expression of a man who was perhaps a little slower than he used to be, a little more easily reassured, a little less likely to read the fine print. I had the recorder in my shirt pocket. It caught everything, including Marcus explaining, in response to a question from Derek about timing, that once the POA was signed, the account consolidation would take about a week, and the property listing could go up in February as planned. I excused myself to use the bathroom. I sat on the edge of the tub for about 90 seconds. Then I washed my hands, looked at myself in the mirror, and went back to the table and had dessert. After Christmas, they had celebrated it with a kind of forced warmth that I recognized as guilt, dressed up as affection. Claire asked me to sit down with her in the living room. Derek was there too. They had printed something out and placed it on the coffee table. The paper had a law firm's letterhead at the top. Claire began speaking in a soft, careful voice. She talked about how much she loved me. She talked about how much easier things would be if we simplified the financial arrangements. She talked about the future with the particular tenderness of someone who has already decided what the future looks like and is now asking you to agree to it. I let her finish. I nodded in the places that seemed to require nodding. I picked up the document. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I set it back down and folded my hands in my lap. Claire, I said, before we talk about this, there's something I'd like to share with you, both of you. I went upstairs. I came back down with my laptop and a small Bluetooth speaker I had set up the night before. I set them on the coffee table beside the unsigned document. I pressed play. The first recording was from November, the kitchen wall conversation. Claire's voice, clear and unmistakable, discussing the timeline, discussing the power of attorney, discussing the place in Westerville where I would adjust. I watched my daughter's face. The color left it in stages, the way heat leaves a room when the furnace shuts off. The second recording was from the December dinner with Marcus. His voice, Derek's voice, the careful language of people who believed they were not being heard. Derek started to say something. I held up one hand. I'm not finished, I said. The third thing I showed them was not a recording. It was a document from Gerald's office, a formal letter summarizing the timeline of events, the dates of each conversation, the nature of the financial protection measures I had already put in place, and a clear statement that any further attempt to obtain power of attorney through coercion or misrepresentation would constitute elder financial abuse under Ohio Revised Code Section 2913.02, which carries penalties including felony charges and civil liability. I let them read it. I gave them time. Then I said, "The house is not available to you. My accounts are not available to you. The financial arrangement we have had here is ending. I want you both out of this house by the 15th of January. Claire started to cry. I want to tell you that it was hard to watch, honestly. It was not because I doubted what I was doing, but because I remembered who she had been when she was small, and grief and clarity can exist in the same moment. Derek did not cry. Derek looked at the document with the expression of a man calculating what options he had left and finding very few. You can't just, he started. Derek, I said, I have a copy of everything on a secured drive at my attorney's office. I have a second copy at a safety deposit box at Huntington Bank on 5th Street. I have sent a summary of the situation to Gerald Whitmore, who is prepared to file a report with the Ohio Adult Protective Services Unit if anything changes between now and January 15th. I would encourage you to consult with your own attorney before you finish that sentence. He finished it differently than he had planned to. He said, This isn't what it looks like. I know what it looks like, I said. I've known for 2 months. I just wanted to make sure the paperwork was in order first. They were out by January 12th, 3 days early, which I thought showed a certain practical intelligence on Derek's part, at least. On January 15th, the original deadline, the day I had told them the house would need to be theirs to vacate, I had a locksmith come and change every exterior lock on the house on Birchwood Lane. I also had Gerald send a formal letter to Marcus, informing him that his role in the attempted financial coercion had been documented, and that any contact with me going forward should be directed to Gerald's office. I did not immediately report them to the police. I want to be honest about why. Partly because Gerald advised that the civil threat alone was sufficient deterrent, and that criminal proceedings would cost me time and energy I had better uses for. But partly, and I am old enough to be honest about this, because she is still my daughter. The recordings were leverage, not a weapon I wanted to fire, unless I had to. What I did instead was file a formal complaint with Ohio Adult Protective Services, which opened a case file. That case file exists. It is a matter of record. Derek's cousin Marcus was interviewed as part of the review. I am told the interview was not comfortable for him. The question I hear sometimes, from people who know the broad strokes of what happened, is, didn't it break your heart? Yes, of course it did. But I want to say something about broken hearts, because I think it matters. A broken heart is not the same as a broken will. Margaret used to say that the worst thing you can do after being hurt is to perform weakness you don't actually feel, because then you become it. She was right about most things. I am 71 years old. I live alone in a house on Birchwood Lane that my wife and I chose together in 1998 because of the oak tree in the backyard. The oak tree is still there. It is larger than it was. I drink my coffee in the morning light and do crosswords I sometimes actually finish now without the low-grade hum of tension that lived in the walls of this house for the last 2 months of last year. I have a neighbor named Franklin, who is 74, and makes the best smoked brisket I have ever eaten. We watch football on Sunday afternoons and argue cheerfully about statistics. I started taking a woodworking class at the community center in February. My instructor says I have good hands for it. Patient, he said. I take my time. I speak to Claire occasionally, not often. The conversations are short and careful, like walking across ice you're not entirely sure will hold. I don't know yet what that relationship becomes. Some things take longer than a few months to resolve. I am learning to be comfortable with that uncertainty, which is perhaps the hardest thing I have done in years, harder than the recordings, harder than the attorney meetings, harder than watching her face go pale in the living room on that January evening. I am not telling you this story because I think I am remarkable. I don't. I think I am an ordinary man who paid attention when it mattered, and who had the good fortune of having spent a career learning that documents are more reliable than promises. I am telling you this story because I know there are people watching this who recognize the feeling, the slow realization, the conversation through the wall, the dinner that felt slightly off, the paper on the coffee table with the law firm's letterhead. If that is you, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not imagining it. You are not too old to protect yourself. You do not need to raise your voice. You do not need to beg or argue or perform frailty to win sympathy. You need a good attorney, a small digital recorder, and the patience to do things in the right order. The oak tree in my backyard has been growing for over 30 years. It does not rush. It does not argue with the wind. It simply grows, season by season, in the direction of the light. I find that useful to remember on mornings when the coffee is good and the crossword is hard and the house is quiet and entirely mine. Thank you for listening. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment below. I read every single one. And if you know someone who might need to hear this, share it with them. Sometimes the most important thing is just knowing you're not alone. Take care of yourselves.